Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We are your multi-award winning Tottenham Hotspur podcast, and we are back as the January transfer window officially opens on Last Word on Spurs. Where have you been? We're on iTunes, we're on Spotify, we're across all major audio platforms, we're of course on X, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, and we're on Blue Sky too. And we have got a bumper show to bring to you in our first January transfer window, of course, as we open. New guest, a familiar face on Last Word on Spurs, one that we never get tired of seeing. And kind of at the very, very top of this show, many will know that I had obviously many years alongside the wonderful Matty Hayes. Matty, I can see you in the comment sections. Much love to Matty Hayes. Many will know Matt has stepped aside from Last Word on Spurs. He remains a very, very close friend of mine, a very, very close friend of Last Word on Spurs. And I said at the time that we've got some amazing, brilliant contributors out there that come onto this show and give us so much of their time, like I say, so much of, sacrificing so much about talking Tottenham, that for me, it takes special certain people that I'm going to link up with. They're going to make this show what it is. And I think I found the next one in line. I'm delighted to welcome, firstly, to Last Word on Spurs. We're going to an amazing guest alongside me for the January transfer window and more. It's my first signing of the transfer window, and hopefully the only one we're going to need to make in this window. I've got the wonderful Sean Butler from the Spurs Talk Show as my co-host. Shawnee, bring us in. How are you, my man?
I'm good, Ricky, mate. It's always, as always, buddy, you give the most wonderful plaudits. The nicest guy in the football community. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to meet Ben for the first time, and Matty, of course, mate. Great to see you there in the chat as well. Big shoes to fill, buddy. I hope I can do it justice for Ricky and for you, mate. But it's great to be here, mate. Great to see everyone in the chat as well. Can't wait to have a great conversation.
Bless you. Shawnee, thank you so much. Look, and joining us for, I think, what is probably the 4th year in a row. And people are asking, Rick, how do you keep getting him back when he's got to come talk about Tottenham? And I say, I don't bloody know why I keep getting him back here, because it is a really tough conversation at times. I've got the superb broadcaster, journalist, events host, football correspondent as well, the superb, the brilliant, what a talker he is, and what a man he is, and the busiest time of his year, as we know. Ben Jacobs is back. Ben, thank you so much for your time. How are you?
Very well. There's pressure, a new presenting partnership, a first journalist of the transfer window, but it's great to be back. I always enjoy listening and coming on the show, and looking forward, if that's the right way of putting it, to speaking about Spurs during what is unfortunately a difficult time for the club.
Benny, thank you so much. Listen, I say, Ben, thank you so much. Really, really do appreciate that. And like you said, there is so much to talk about on Spurs. And I kind of give everybody a lowdown what we are looking to cover during this show. Look, there are strong links, of course, to, as many know, a lot of midfielders, forwards, defenders out there. We'll be covering all that and more in, of course, this transfer window update. And I have to just start, I can't say it's housekeeping. All I would say, it's just kind of the general feeling that as Spurs fans, that we've seen it before and will no doubt see it again. And it's congratulations to Emerson Royale, who becomes the very latest in a line of former Spurs players to go on and win a trophy. So congratulations to Emerson Royale. Almost written in the stars, wasn't it? As soon as Spurs release a player, they go on and win a trophy. I'm going to have to ask you, Ben, I think that's the 145th player to have left Spurs to win a trophy. Are we going to end this trophy drought at some point, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, let's just think about how close they could already be to doing that with a run in the League Cup. And it could be one of those that just sort of calms the nerves and adds a little bit of optimism and hope. But there is just that odd knack, isn't it, of leave Spurs, win a trophy, although not really been that routine for Harry Kane to sort of go and do that. But Emerson Royale, congratulations to him. And who knows, Tottenham might be next, because remember what Ange said? He always delivers something in his second season.
He does.
Let's be honest, guys, right? Isn't it the biggest draw? People always ask me, like, Sean, why would this player come to Tottenham? I want to say, because after Tottenham, they're going to win a trophy. If you come to Tottenham 4 years later, you're going to pick up your trophy. It's the biggest draw. It doesn't matter about money, anything else. Trophies come later. It's perfect.
Honestly, Shawnee, Maybe that's the reason why we need to keep this show going as a live show to kind of encourage players that are listening to Ben, come and join us. No matter what, you're going to be guaranteed a trophy at some point during down the line, even if you're not even at the bloody football club that we want you to sign for. Right, we're going to open a last word on Spurs. Look, bit of business we've got to deal with here. We have to have a bit of business first, and we have to talk about the future of Ange Postecoglou to begin with and what Ben has made of the season so far. Lots of transfer stuff to come, but Ben, need to get your thoughts on where Spurs are in your opinion. Look, as many will know, look, we finished that Newcastle game having 11 players missing by the half-time with an illness bug sweeping through the camp. Spurs, as I mentioned, ending the game with a midfielder and a right-back playing as central defenders and a goalkeeper making his debut after a decade at the football club. That includes 2 18-year-olds in the spine of the side because the situation has been that dire of all the injuries that we've had and absentees that we've had. But look, stats-wise, it's damning. It's 0 wins in 6 games at home since beating Aston Villa more than 2 months ago. We're on our current worst home league run without a win since the 93-94 season. We are 2 points from a possible 18. We've lost half of the games that we've played, 10 defeats in 20. We've scored 15. We've conceded 17 in our last 8 games. Spurs currently sit in the Premier League 12th as things stand. We are, at the moment, 12 points off the current top 4 and only 8 points off the relegation battle. It is officially our worst start to a season since the 08-09 season. Ben, it feels like unprecedented times I'm bringing you on here discussing Spurs domestically, but what have you made of Ange Postecoglou's second season at the club so far?
Yeah, I mean, when you lay out all the stats like that at 10 at night in this late kickoff that we're doing, there may be some listeners that are about to cry themselves to sleep. So I apologize for that. But I come with some positives, I suppose, from a more neutral point of view with my journalist cap on. So, yeah, the stats are damning. There's no denying that. 10 defeats, not looking good. Certain losses, very infuriating, regardless of who's out on the field because of the game management. Chelsea, in particular, a reluctance to maybe be more flexible in philosophy or system. And yet, it's a young squad and the potential is there. And I think the most irritating thing, probably as a Spurs fan, is every time you see some kind of step forwards, it's a false dawn. Man City followed by Ipswich. Every time you see a relatively credible and plucky performance with a lot of the young potential or some of the depth getting their opportunities because the injuries is not matched by a result. And that's why Ange Postecoglou was probably so pleased with the Newcastle performance, but naturally disappointed by the result. So where to start? Because you can say, well, of course they're inconsistent when the likes of Vicario, Van de Ven's been out, Romero, Destiny, Doggy, when your defense is desecrated, of course the results are not going to come. And there was kind of a weird point, I think probably about a month ago now, when Tottenham had just about the best attack in the league and just about the best defense in the league. And yet, statistically, despite those two, which should add up to more points, they were mid-table, and now they're still mid-table, but unfortunately they've leaked even more goals. So I think what I've made of the season so far is 1, a need for more depth and experience. 2, a backing for Postecoglou in the market if, as we understand, his job is safe. 3, a form of consistent, not singular, but frontline goal scorers, plural. So we know in the past with other managers, there was the reliance on the goals of Harry Kane, and that might have made the headlines, but Son was obviously another player that was on form. So it's not just about saying Dom Solanke needs to get 20 plus goals. It's about how do you get that link-up play? And if we flash back to when Postecoglou first came in, you had Maddison and Son, and actually, and bizarrely almost, with Harry Kane gone, Son played in a more advanced role. Maddison and Son linked up. They started the season very well. They went top of the Premier League, and everyone went, wow, this Postecoglou guy, he's going to win us the Premier League. But it's leveled off. The partnerships are not as effective. The selection due to injuries is not as consistent. The goals are unfortunately too easily given away. and too obvious. You can see them coming 2 or 3 phases before they go in, and you think, here we go again, which was the case with Chelsea. Once they got one back, it always looked like they were going to win that game. And the points tally is reflected in that. You're talking about 51 points in the Premier League in the last calendar year in 2024. That's the worst return in a calendar year for Tottenham since 2008, when they only got 42 points. So there's no statistical progress, but there are mitigating circumstances, some of which I've mentioned. And that's why I think Postecoglou will be given more time. And if he can just somehow get through the Liverpool game, who knows, get a North London derby in the final and win the League Cup, at least then there's kind of something to celebrate, something to cling to, a guaranteed form of European football to build on. And that might just stop the rot. But right now, it just feels like every time Spurs take 1 step forwards, they unfortunately take 2 steps back. And no manager can continue like that, backed or not backed, in the long run, simply because Tottenham's expectation has to still be season on season. They can't get there overnight. Champions League football. And if you think top 5, not top 4, might be good enough for that, even more so. And right now, they don't even look like close to making a challenge for the top 6. And that's what Postecoglou, through the market, through the young players, through the experienced players coming back from injury, through the identity that he's trying to build, that's what he has to get back. Because this isn't just one result is good, one result is bad. This is 2 steps back to the point where now the progress they're looking for is actually to realign themselves and catch up with the European contenders. In other words, play with the same consistency as a Fulham or a Bournemouth or an Aston Villa. And they're more like Brighton or even West Ham at the moment. And this mid-table mediocrity, unfortunately, even though it's incredibly entertaining, is a hallmark at the moment of where Tottenham are.
Yeah, Ben, just with that, mate, listen, the first set of stats here that Ricky called out was painful enough to hear. As someone that has been a backer of Ange, as someone that likes to lean onto those sort of things that you mentioned that maybe few and far between at the moment, things where you can hang your hat on. But Ricky's also asked me to kind of follow up here with some more stats that are painful and really, really, I guess, devastating to have to see this and read these out again. But I'm going to carry on with some more stats here that just really compound on the pressure here. 1 win in 8, 3 losses in our last 5 home games, of which all of them were winless. 5 points in our last 8 from the Premier League. 30 points taken from a possible 81 available. 10 Premier League defeats so far this season. We didn't lose 10 until April of last season in the Premier League. 3 wins in the last 13 games. Tottenham Hotspur have lost 14 of our last 26. A bigger margin than that is 23 Premier League defeats out of our last 45. How about this? 4 points from a possible 24 against Leicester, Brighton, Palace, Ipswich, Fulham, Bournemouth, Forest and Wolves. I guess all teams we would hope that in a normal season we would get a lot more from. And then obviously the worst part, I guess, is that we're bottom half of the table for the first time in 16 years. We've lost more games than Fulham, Brighton, Brentford, West Ham, Palace and Everton. And we are only 2 losses away from equaling the total amount of losses from the 23-24 Premier League campaign entirely, which was, of course, 12. So, Ben, I guess as a follow-up, having heard all that and the first set of stats, do you think that Ange Postecoglou is the guy that can turn things around for Tottenham and save our season?
Yeah, I think so. And like I said before, I think winning a trophy would go a long way to building that second half of the season momentum. Luckily for, I think, Postecoglou, there are the mitigating circumstances that I alluded to before, and that will at least buy him more time, which is why his job is under no imminent threat at the moment. But the December stats, and before the festive period and in late November, the points were not great, nor was the league position. But the basic stats, have you got a better XG than the opponent you're playing? Are you creating big chances? Are you having more shots on target? Are you having more of the ball? Are you keeping clean sheets? Are you dominating at home? And each time that doesn't always lead to results, which is even more frustrating if you're watching it and paying your hard-earned money. But you say eventually that will even itself out. If in more games than not, your XG is above your opponents, if more games than not, you're creating big chances, even if you're missing them, you start to think, okay, eventually we're going to get results like we saw Tottenham against Manchester City, where you think, wow, that's the potential. that's what happens when everything clicks. And then the fit back line on paper, I think, is as good as any back line in the Premier League. It's probably only, dare I say, the A-words back line that on paper, at least, is close. And then you could probably make an argument about Chelsea's backline having potential, but I think most would take on form the likes of a fit Udogie, a Mickey van der Ven, a Christian Romero, a Pedro Porro, and so on. And Archie Gray can even go and play at right back, who's got huge potential and hasn't been able to quite live up to it at the moment. So there's a lot to like about Tottenham on paper, just not in practice or, of course, unfortunately, in the trophy cabinet either. And when we were in kind of November, you thought, this might still all click. And suddenly they head into December and defensively they just fell to pieces. 12 goals conceded in December. Nobody let in more in the Premier League. 85 shots faced. Nobody had worse in the Premier League. Nearly 40 shots, I think it was, of those 85 on target, and a cumulative expected goals against of 13.5. So if you think the 12 is bad, they were supposed to let in nearly 14, and they're giving up big chances like Santa hands out Christmas presents, or they're as generous as the daily gifts that you get for Hanukkah. And they need to have more of a ruthlessness and a stinginess about them, because regardless of what Postecoglou wants to do, which is high octane, high intensity, attack minded football, if he can't keep clean sheets in games, and more importantly, if he can't protect a lead, regardless of what the score is, then Tottenham are not going to move in the right direction. And I think that within the hierarchy, I'm told anyway at the moment, it's not the stats they're looking at, it's the constrictive circumstances in which Postecoglou has had to work. He's not been able to pick a consistent 11. It's a revamp with a lot of young players that, as we saw at Chelsea, might need 2 or 3 years to come to fruition. And I feel sorry for some of those young players, because your Bergvals or your Greys, they're getting a bit of scrutiny, right? Because they're being thrown in at the deep end. But what choice does Postecoglou have, given the fact that there's other injuries? You've got a player like Reguilon, who's not supposed to be part of the setup at all. He's surplus to requirements, but Udogie gets injured and he comes back into the fold as well. You got somebody like Jed Spence, who was supposed to be a goner at Tottenham, and Genoa bid something in the region of 3 million, and Tottenham thought that that was far too low because the option to buy was about 7 million euros. He comes back, nobody wants him. Suddenly he finds himself in the first team, and he's even started games as well. But the constant rotation, the lack of depth in some big games, defenders in particular going off injured and then the game's turning. I think Tottenham are looking at all of this as well. And for now, anyway, they're still finding enough positives to feel like Ange Postecoglou is the right man to turn things around in the second half of the season.
Ben, like I say, I mean, look, we've been very damning there in terms of the stats. And I will, just for the balance of play, just try and even that out by the fact that, look, Ange has managed, you know, when you look at a portion of games, 68 games, he had the first choice back five of Vicario, Porro, Romero, Van der Ven, and Udogie for 25 of those matches. So that's only 37% of all matches. In the 25 of our first choice back five, it's 14 wins, 5 draws, 6 losses for 47 points, which amounts to 1.88 points per game. In the 43 matches without our first choice back five, it's 19 wins, 6 draws, 18 losses, and that would bring you to around 63 points, which is 1.47 points per game. This season alone, Ange has been able to only start the first choice back five in 8 out of the 27 matches, only 30% of all matches. So I think on that basis alone, many would argue, and you can't get away from it, as you've opened up and said, he has been clearly dealt a really tricky hand in terms of the injuries, in terms of the absentees, and then to have that bug go right through the camp last week. You know, I think last week that Newcastle game was a bit of an anomaly. I don't think you can really judge it because, you know, I still feel for those that are really much behind Ange Postecoglou, I feel that the players are still fighting for him right now. I think you can see that by the way they're taking to the field. They're putting their performances in, certainly against Newcastle. I didn't see any player there, in my opinion, that were giving up on the manager and not doing the job. But I just wonder, Ben, you're saying for now, from what you understand, I think David Ornstein said it also in the week, that his job for now is 100% safe and the Spurs hierarchy are backing him to lead this project. But I'm just intrigued to know, Ben, just to push it a little bit more, I've got to ask the tough questions. Ben, what do you think the tipping point would be this season? Would it be if Tottenham want to go out all the cups, that will make his job hard? I mean, I've made the point that I just don't see any benefit in sacking Ange Postecoglou if you're going to deploy Ryan Mason for a third time as the caretaker. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't think there'll be any uplift. So I just wonder, from your perspective, in case many might feel out there that we're sleepwalking our way into a relegation battle, and people might think that's dramatic, but we're only 8 points off the current relegation places. What do you think, Ben, is a tipping point?
I think the tipping point is if he loses the dressing room, at least between now and the end of the season. And then at the end of the season, there will be, I understand, an end of season review that's more sort of pre-planned than Postecoglou focused. And what that means is that they will sit collaboratively rather than without Postecoglou in the room to assess what ultimately needs to change, because even if momentum is on their side in the second half of the season, and arguably even if they win the League Cup, there'll still need to be a post-mortem over what they need and are they buying right, and over what this identity and philosophy is. Because when we first spoke in the, I'd say, 6 months or maybe even year that Postecoglou came in, the natural reaction was to say, I can see a clear identity. He felt quite likable. The football was very entertaining and people were patient because it was obvious from day one what he was trying to do, how he was trying to play. And his CV, wherever he's been, is as a relatively serial winner. But now we're in a slightly different position because since Maurizio Pochettino, Ange Postecoglou is the longest serving Spurs manager. He's outlasted game-wise Mourinho, Conte. So we're not talking about somebody new anymore. We're talking about someone that if they stick with him beyond this summer, which is still the expectation for now, it becomes a long-term project. And in the same way that Postecoglou said he demands results and he always gets results or trophies anyway in his second season, the Tottenham hierarchy will have to look at Tottenham into next season under the manager and say, well, we demand something from our project, because that is what projects tend to yield. It won't always be trophies, as we've seen with Mikel Arteta. But after about 3 years, you understood the recruitment, you could see the depth, and their points tally increased season on season. And that's really all you can ask for. And then if that happens in consecutive or 3 seasons in a row, your points tally is likely to go from 50-60 to 60-70 to 70-80. Maybe not good enough to win the Premier League, but 80, if not 70, will always be good enough for 5th place. And with the coefficient, that might be good enough for Champions League football. So Spurs need to go back to setting that goal of saying there shouldn't even be doubt as to us being in the conversation in any given season for Champions League. Then when you get that, you budget for that, you buy for that, and you can develop as a project. But it's too up-down at the moment. And I think when you say there's no sign that the players don't buy into Postecoglou, I would add he is seen as a very atypical manager and personality. And some of the public-facing stuff, the mate this, the mate that, the dry humor, the quips, they're very celebrated. And he's honest and he's frank and he's genuine. But behind closed doors, he is quite aloof. And I don't mean that as a negative in the sense that he's ignoring anyone or he's not involved, but there is quite an old school managerial authority where he deals with his players in a set way and is adaptable and flexible. So no one's saying there's no open door policy, but he's not in there with his players 24/7. He's very much the manager in the group, whereas other younger managers are a bit more integrated into the group. And I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong, but it means that the players actually don't know him that well on a personal level compared to perhaps somebody like Maurizio Pochettino that would throw barbecues for everyone, that would meet the players' families. And I'm not here to judge right and wrong. I'm not here to say one is better than the other. So this is not a criticism of Ange Postecoglou. But intriguingly, a lot of players I've spoken to, and I did an interview about a year ago with Dejan Kulusevski, say he's a bit of an enigma. And it reminds me of Claudio Ranieri at my team, Leicester, where publicly there was a lot of headlines and glitz and glamour and laughter, and everyone thought they knew Ranieri. And then behind the scenes, he had an iron fist and he was very different. He was very short-tempered, and there wasn't necessarily the personal affinity with that playing squad, but they went on autopilot and won the Premier League because they bought into the philosophy, even though they didn't know the man particularly well. And they celebrated Ranieri's sort of public personality and his humor and his style. But behind closed doors, they only really knew him as a kind of school teacher-like figure that was much more abrasive with the playing squad. And I think there are two Postecoglou's. And now what we're seeing is the private Postecoglou in his media interviews become a little bit more short-tempered. And there's, I think, a more of a grey area between how he's acting day on day at the club and how he's acting out in the media. And that tells you, I think, that he thinks he's under a little bit of pressure. So if it gets to the point where the players doubt him or feel that they don't have that unity, and we're clearly not there yet, that's the point in which I think senior players will be part of some kind of conversation that usually happens with ownership, and that will be factored into whether a replacement is ultimately found. But we're not there yet. We're not on a game-by-game basis. We're not on a mid-season exit. We're not even necessarily on any kind of summer change either. So he is 100% safe for now, but the first cracks will be if those players start to lose faith in their manager.
But it's really interesting, the answer you gave there, because I think it leads perfectly into the next question I have for you, which, you know, I'm a backer of Ange. I'm not ready for any new project yet. I sort of understand why people feel the way they do about the kind of reservations. One of the things I would say that I completely agree and I can understand now a bit more. I didn't know about that kind of two versions of Ange, the public facing and the private facing, but I would kind of stretch that narrative a little bit and suggest that one of the problems that I do have with him is I think he makes a rod for his own back a little bit with some of the kind of things that he says to us or through you guys to us, and then sometimes maybe acts in a different way with his actions, or maybe just changing his mind and saying one thing 1 minute and another thing another. We saw away from the specifics of transfers, but we saw with the way he treated the Christian Romero thing, saying we shouldn't be calling the club out in public, and then 24 hours later he went after Timo in a similar vein. I think when it came to his transfer policy, he said, you know, back in September, he was very happy with the squad. At the same time, I recall when he first came into the club, he said things like, you know, the gap between the very best and the next level down isn't technicality, it's mentality. And that's the sort of thing that he's looking for. And at the same time is an advocate of, you know, the youth process, the youth profile, I guess, that the club's transfer policies are. And I find that strange, because if we're going after 18-year-olds, I don't know how they could have possibly demonstrated this mentality monster kind of strengths that he says himself that he looks to prioritize. He's mentioned that he likes kind of working with young players because sometimes you can't teach old dogs new tricks. But at the same time, has recently said that he'd like now the club to pivot away from the youth policy. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that he doesn't want to get people or bring in new players that are going to stand in the way of some of these young guys. And so he'd like some kind of more leadership figures maybe to come in and to play around the youth-centric model that we've now sort of got through that initial stages of building. And so I'm constantly hearing, even with the tactics, you know, he says, I'm not for changing. I think that there has been some pretty obvious shifts. I think we saw against Newcastle, there was a much widening of the back four, like the midfield, the guys that were playing in the eights were coming drifting wide, the ability for Brandon Austin to hit the ball long. None of those things would be typically described as Ange ball, yet he says he's not for changing and he's never going to change. But ultimately, there has been some changes in that regard. So again, there's just a bit of a disconnect with me with some of the things that you hear versus some of the things that you then hear later or that you see. And so ultimately, you know, when he says that he's happy with the youth policy and he was happy with the window, but he's up against the reality, the stark reality of the Premier League, how hard it is, the ferocity of the games. My question to you, I guess, is, you know, has Postecoglou been, I guess, entirely honest with whether he feels like he's been backed by the club and giving him everything that he needs to try to sort of take us forward this season?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing in football how when things are going rosy or you're new, you want youth and you want to back them and you want to promote them and hero them in public. And then when things turn, you start saying, I'm lacking experience. I want to buy older. I want to go against the model that we started with. And one of the challenges for Postecoglou is, if you remember when he came in, the recruitment team was still building. And we'll speak about the role, I think, of Paratici a little bit later as well. But everything was quite thin as far as structure in Tottenham's recruitment process. And part of that was because Daniel Levy had obviously been across so much and still is, arguably. But there was also the reality of it not just being Postecoglou, but a series of executive and recruitment people all coming in at the same time. And I'm not sure that there was that much of a plan in place in terms of succeeding Harry Kane, in terms of finding a younger, longer-term replacement for Son. There was a lot of opportunism in the market, Timo Werner being a good example, but it doesn't look like he's necessarily going to stay at the club permanently. So you constantly see this paradox almost of what is our plan? Well, it's to buy young, it's to build for the future, it's to invest in players and bring them through our academy, it's to create a connection with the fan base in the attack-minded style of football we play. And then the flip side is you get mid-table, you get a big injury, and you need experience and to go against that plan because you're firefighting. And I think this is kind of Antonio Conte's frustration, and I think Postecoglou's finding this as well. Too much of Tottenham's recruitment in the past, even if it pays off with some of the youngsters, has been about depth. And that seems to be a word that I hear all the time. And depth is fine, with Radu Dragusin being another good example. But depth doesn't win you trophies. Your starting 11, staying fit and having quality do. And then the depth tops it up. And of course, it's important. But if you've basically got, let's just call it, half your squad as depth players that you're not that confident can keep you in a Champions League race if they have to start more than 15 games a season, and then you add the intensity and the style that Postecoglou plays, which has a physical bearing on his squad and maybe contributing to fatigue, especially during this busy period, it all means that if most teams need depth, Tottenham need depth upon depth upon depth. But at the same time, you don't want to have a squad of 30 plus or something ridiculous. Like look at Chelsea under Graham Potter, where half the players couldn't even fit in the dressing rooms at Cobham because there were too many of them. So this is the challenge, that the recruitment philosophy changes each time to factor in the pressure and the league position and the stats and the injuries. And Postecoglou has to find a way with his recruitment team of stabilizing that. And really the only way that you can do that in likelihood is spending more money and buying somebody established that you know has a reliable record, stats that you think are going to be conducive to transfer to Tottenham and the Premier League if they're outside, and a track record of not getting injured, because then you say 2 or 3 of them could make all of the difference. And maybe they felt that they had that with Dominic Solanke. Maybe they believe that Son, despite his age, is still capable of chipping in. Perhaps they felt that James Maddison was the answer and he got off to a fantastic start at the beginning of his Tottenham career. So, you know, hindsight can allow you to pull apart the hodgepodge recruitment and not see that much of a plan and see a constant changing of what they need and a frustration as a result. But they have been hit with a lot of mitigating circumstances that, to be fair to Tottenham and Postecoglou, we should also point out as well, because that ultimately is balanced journalism.
Absolutely. Look, we're going to squeeze in our first break of the show for our listeners on audio. We have got nearly over 5,000 of you that are watching the show live. As always, thanks so much for all your incredible support for Last Word on Spurs, as Ben Jacobs officially opens the door of Last Word on Spurs' January transfer window. And alongside us, like I say, I've made our first, the only signing of this January window that I'm ever going to need. And it's the wonderful Sean over at the Spurs Talk Show, who is my co-host. And I think it's been a good start so far. I think it's been a good start. We've been a good cracking start, just like Spurs have started under Ange. Let's hope it only carries on one way and we don't have a downward trajectory. Let's hope we can survive the first season. Don't talk about the second season. Just carry on talking about the first season. Although don't talk about the second part of the first season. Only talk about the first 10 games, right? Only talk about the first 10 games.
We need.
Listen, we've got a lot to talk about on this last one on Spurs. I will just say, look, we're not one to advocate really pushing us to, to really, we always don't really push the whole subscribe thing or the like and share the video. But what I will say right now is that, look, we've got so much content we're bringing you over the course of the transfer window. We've got Ben very luckily back towards the end of it as well. So look, to share this to a wider Spurs audience, I'm going to encourage and implore the audience out there, if you like what you're watching, if you like what you're seeing, please do hit that subscribe button. Please like the video so it goes out to a wider reach of the Spurs community. And, Ben, I'm going to turn to a subject next. We are coming to transfers, by the way, can I just say, we're coming to transfers very, very shortly. And, Ben, you did break quite a big exclusive on this show. I want to say, oh, God, it was... you have to forgive me now, Ben. My mind, having 2 kids under 4, I'm honestly all over the place. But you'll know, obviously, when you came on, you discussed that takeover at the time and how much really... I don't know what your phone was like that week when you broke it, but it was significantly busy, I would imagine. There are a lot of rumours around Tottenham that they are preparing themselves for a potential future takeover. And the links to Amanda Staveley do not go away from the football club. Amanda has been pictured at least twice at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium already during this season. Now, there are reports out there that Staveley is being offered an informal advisory position on the 2034 World Cup board for the Saudi Arabia Football Federation. Now, Daniel Levy did say in a recent fans forum that some form of a minority investment is what we're looking for. We've got nothing to announce at the moment, but we are in the market. And I think you'll know, Ben, given the nature of your connections around Tottenham, the wonderful Sam Matterface that you work with, and obviously Crookie as well, that I think it's fair to say that this is probably the most unpopular I think I've ever seen ENIC, Daniel Levy in general. I'm intrigued to know from your perspective if you've heard any news since you broke it on here with regards to any potential future takeover of Tottenham.
Yeah, so we're talking January 2023 when QSI, the owners of PSG, held minority investment talks, albeit exploratory ones, with Daniel Levy and Nasser Al-Khalifi. And Levy have a very strong relationship. And the expectation at that time was that there was 15 or 20% of the club for sale, perhaps not all in one go, maybe more 5 to 7, and then an ability to add to that share stake over a period of 3 to 5 years. But ultimately, about a quarter of the club at maximum, if you go to the higher end, 25%, possibly available, but more likely in that 15 to 20%. And not a lot has changed. So we hear a lot about how certain suitors have come and allegedly tried to buy 100% of the club. That's not my understanding. And I think Daniel Levy has backed that up now publicly by stating that Tottenham are looking for a form of minority investment. And that has been an ongoing process for at least a year, if not closer to 2 years. And Levy is handling it. He's not putting it on the market like Manchester United did via Rain Group. But what he is hoping for is a strategic partner. And Amanda Staveley would tick that box. She is looking for 10 to 15% of a Premier League football club after leaving Newcastle under disappointing circumstances. And it's interesting because if she ends up taking a role, as you suggest, on the 2034 Saudi World Cup team, on that advisory board, the Supreme Committee, as it's known, you also have Yasser Al-Rumayyan, who is the Newcastle United chair. And Al-Rumayyan and Staveley worked very closely together to broker the long-running Newcastle takeover. But once she was in there, the relationship between Staveley and PIF broke down. And it was very apparent long before she did leave that that exit would be staggered. And it took the best part of 3 years. And we now know in retrospect that her share stake diminished. So now she's out entirely. She is holding talks about the possibility of investing somewhere else. She spoke to John Textor, who has 45% of Crystal Palace up for sale, but another group, an American Saudi group, are currently in exclusivity there. And now she continues dialogue with Daniel Levy about a potential small stake in Spurs. And what Staveley is looking for in the long run is not just a small stake, but that hands-on ability to be part of a club day in, day out, as she was at Newcastle United. And originally the dynamic at Newcastle suited her because she was able to run the club and PIF were very distant. And then flash forwards, PIF got more involved, as did the Rubin brothers, and Staveley kind of got boxed out. So if this was to work, it won't just be a financial consideration. It's what would be the dynamic if anything progresses between Staveley and Daniel Levy, because Daniel, as far as I'm aware, is not looking to back down. He wants the day-to-day running of the club as well. So a more silent partner may be more beneficial as far as Daniel is concerned. So we'll have to wait and see whether that develops, but I can confirm that the parties have been engaged in what I would only term exploratory talks, but for quite some time. Nothing is exclusive. And then the last point that I would make is I've got clarity from sources on price as well. And my understanding is that all debt included, the valuation of the club is 4 billion. And if you remove any of the liabilities or debts or anything like that, then 3 billion is the kind of base price of the club. So that makes it quite interesting, because if you look at Amanda Staveley and Newcastle, she was part of a consortium that bought Newcastle United for £305 million, and she put in 10%. Now, if she wants that same 10% of Spurs, she basically has to put in the full amount of what the whole group paid for Newcastle. So it's a 300 million plus investment just for 10%. And you may not get any control. You might have to be more a strategic investor or a silent partner. So this is why it's taken so long to find the kind of partner, because Daniel Levy is effectively very picky, because he doesn't want to step back from the day-to-day management of the football club at this stage.
Ben, just quickly as a follow-up to that topic, it's a topic that's very close to my heart. I talk about it a lot on my channel. I guess the overarching follow-up, whenever I do updates on things that you're saying or other journalists, and I bring it to the channel, the questions and the comments I always get is, don't really care how much it costs. What I want to know is, where does the money go? Does the money that would come in, whether it's 500 million, if it was Staveley or somebody else, does that money stay in the club? Does it go towards transfers? Does it go towards building a hotel? Does it go towards Joe Lewis and his exit and the family that want to kind of, move on? Do you have any kind of insight into what that, whatever the money might be, but predominantly, I guess, is it going to be within Tottenham? Can we use it, or is it going to be leaving and going into the pockets of the current owners?
No, I don't think it's a line the pocket type thing. Usually when a club says that they want a strategic partner, it means exactly that: somebody to invest in the club, buy a stake, and then put that capital into the running of the club. So Tottenham are looking for non-football business. They're looking for infrastructural, continued improvements and modernization. Of course, they've done it with the stadium and the training facility, but there's other areas where you can modernize and grow your brand, or alternatively, you can invest in aspects of the club that still do need a bit of modernization, such as the women's team, for example. So the money will go across the board, but into the business rather than into a transfer committee. And usually that kind of investment can be used to restructure debt. You might convert some of it to equity, infrastructural improvements, fan engagement, brand growth. And then from there, you set yourself up to raise the value of the club and ultimately raise your revenue streams. So clubs with strategic investors, Arsenal and PSG is another good example, are often trying to stop the flow of new capital just being swallowed up into your subsumed costs, whether that's your wage bill, whether that's your need to buy, whether that's debt, whatever it is. The last thing you want to do is throw new money into the pot and find that it effectively just gets swallowed up because your foundational ability to make new revenue in all areas of the business isn't there. And a more silent strategic partner, from my experience of covering many takeovers, it tends to see the return on investment as: 1, I put my money in; 2, I own a stake; 3, I let the business run as is; 4, I trust that they're going to use foundationally the money put in to improve the agreed areas, and effectively then sit back and get a return on investment. But if, as Manchester United have noted, you constantly put money into the club, but guess what? At the same time as you put money in the club, your roof is leaking, or your players sign a new 5-year deal like Rashford on 325k a week. Eventually, over a period of time where that player may not want to leave, or that roof might not be fixed, or the results don't go your way, so you get no Champions League football or lower attendances or whatever it is, eventually that big lump sum that you started with disappears because you've not actually fixed the basic foundations infrastructurally or foundationally at your club. And this is basically what Levy wants, to move the club on, not just about, we've got a great stadium, we've got a great training facility, but how can we actually put that money into, for example, academy development, like I said before, the women's team, fan engagement, food, beverage, non-football income. And I know when it's sort of spelled out like that, you're thinking, it's 11 o'clock at night, I'm bored, I want to hear the transfers, you're sending me to sleep.
But
not me, I love it. Keep talking. I love this stuff.
Weird thing about these small marginal gains, build a hotel or come up with an academy program that you've not done before, or stage a concert or other non-football income, or build a new hospitality suite. Immediately, everybody always goes, well, that money could have been spent on a player that we wouldn't put another 5 million on. And if we'd have just paid the extra 5 million instead of X, Y, and Z, then we'd be first in the table. But again, your panic buy at X million paying above the odds weakens you in the market. And at the same time, it is a stopgap. And if it doesn't work, you've invested a lot of money and you haven't got any return. Whereas the latter approach, as boring as it may sound, gives you this consistency of income and revenue opportunities, which eventually means that every new bit of capital from, for example, a strategic investor is actually money you can spend on something in the long run, because your basic income streams are more reliable. And that's why clubs want to find strategic investors, even though fans just hear investor money and hope it immediately goes on the transfer market.
Cool. Ben, thank you so much for that real conclusive update. Everybody out there, it is going to be transfer time. It is now. Look, we've discussed already about the nature of the way Spurs have done business so far. Shorty very kindly brought that into the show at the earlier point. And I think what's very, very clear is that, look, for Ange Postecoglou's football to work, not only is he going to need bodies, he's going to need players that have got ability and a certain caliber to be able to play the brand of football that he wants. Now, there has been reports that Spurs are looking across a number of different positions. That includes a new centre-back, a left-back, a midfielder. And we also understand in this recent 24, 48 hours, Tottenham are also targeting a centre-forward. Now, there has been, again, reports around the fact that Fabio Paratici is assisting Tottenham with a searching of these players, and who we understand, despite moving into now a consultancy capacity, is still working behind the scenes at Hotspur Way. And as only as Newcastle over at the weekend, where Paratici was seen pacing up and down the walls at Hotspur Way, he's expected still to have a very big influence on this transfer window. So the nice easy one to ask you, Ben, is, I know there's been jokes out there, Spurs are looking for a squad, they're looking for a new team. Can you give us an idea of the key positions you think Tottenham are going to look to do in this transfer window, and how key will Fabio Paratici's influence be in order to get those positions over the line?
Yeah, Paratici's pulling the strings. It's as simple as that. You don't pace full stop unless you're anxious. And in football, anybody on a phone pacing and anxious is usually some kind of sporting director from experience. So he's still heavily involved. Call it what you will, a de facto sporting director, a consultant. The ban obviously changed the title and the dynamic, but he's still there and involved. And maybe that is one of the reasons for a bit of a mismatch in strategy, because you got one guy that was working under Conte. It's a massive extreme to go from Conte ball to Ange ball. And naturally, somebody like Paratici is intelligent and doesn't have a fixed recruitment style. But you're planning 3 to 5 windows ahead in football usually. So he will have had to adapt, and so will all of the newer people in the recruitment team, because this is a completely different requirement needed for Tottenham to do business effectively in the market. I know we'll come on to some specifics in a moment, so I'll keep the positions general. But what we know is that Vicario injured and the new goalkeeper has already come in. We can break him down in a moment. And Ange had obviously said originally, no, a goalkeeper's not needed, but one
just
was.
Not literally break him down, Ben. We've already got enough injuries as it is, just to be clear.
I think that is probably the worst phrase I could have used about any Spurs player, because you're absolutely right in what you say.
Right now, break him down. We've got to level out.
Analyse him.
And we've had a whole sickness bug swept through the camp.
We will analyse him. the very fit, non-ill, non-injury ravaged, new, young, talented Tottenham goalkeeper will be analysed, but he will not be broken down.
I just knew there's a dagger that went through everybody's heart there when they heard the word broken down. What? Not more, surely.
But I think, look, position-wise, they want a centre-back. We've said this many times, and that's still the case. When the centre-backs are fit, great, but there's a bit of depth there. And I'm not sure that Radu Dragusin is necessarily seen as the long-term answer either. So we'll wait and see what his long-term future is. Then an attacker is a very realistic possibility. And I think also a left-sided player with a view to Timo Werner likely not staying at the club. And a question mark probably in the long run over Son as well. And the reason why it's difficult when you talk about positions with Tottenham is because Postecoglou's mentality in recruitment meetings is 2 positions are needed. So somebody that can play like Archie Gray, right back or centre back. Somebody like Timo Werner that can play out wide or through the centre. Somebody like Son that can play out wide behind the striker from a deeper position or even lead the line, as he showed when Harry Kane left. So Postecoglou sees value in versatility. And that means that whoever Tottenham get, it won't just be one position. I think left back is going to be one big target area to watch, whether in January or whether in the summer. And Tottenham are there for Milos Kirkos, for example, along with Manchester United, who are probably the front runners at this stage. I don't think Bournemouth will sell in January. They want 40+ million, but in the summer, Kirkos has got a new agent. So let's wait and see. And you never know, Manchester United might get PSG's Nuno Mendes, who Ruben Amorim gave his debut to at Sporting. And then that will be their left back covered. And then Kirkos may be available in the market to a slightly smaller pool of Premier League clubs, and the player would prefer to stay in England. So Tottenham could be there as far as Kirkos is concerned. There might be some long-term need to address the Pedro Porro situation. I don't think Spurs have any intent to sell, but it's true that if Real Madrid were not to get Trent Alexander-Arnold, then Porro is one of 3 on their short list. There's no real panic at Tottenham, but they have to be aware of the fullback situation, mostly left-sided. And as I say, centre-back, striker, and a kind of versatile wide player. So it's pretty much everywhere, given they've already bought the goalkeeper, aside from midfield. And even in midfield, we might see some kind of move for Johnny Cardoso in the summer when that clause becomes active. So you can tell really that they actually feel they need something virtually all over the park.
Ben, obviously, I know for most fans, we want to sort of move on to the next. As soon as we brought one in, we want to carry on. Who's next? What have you done for me lately? But I just want to go back a little bit to Anton Kinsky, if that's okay, because it is pretty recent. Let's be honest, only a couple of days ago. Just on the goalkeeping situation, 21-year-old, 6-year deal, £12.5 million, including add-ons. I mean, his stats look fantastic, right? 83.3%, I think. Is the highest save percentage. It would be the highest save percentage in the Premier League this season, and it's the highest of any goalkeeper in the top 10 European leagues, I believe. So less goals conceded per 90 than anybody else at 0.37 goals. Nobody has more clean sheets. So from what I've seen of him and what I've read about his initial quotes, he seems like an incredibly confident guy, someone who obviously wants to come in here and compete for the first team spot. So I'd like to ask you, about what the belief within the club is around where he does sit in that kind of that stack rank, that pecking order, and also, if you don't mind, if you have time to sort of extrapolate a little bit around what does that look like then for Brandon Austin after his solid debut last week, Josh Keeley over in Leyton Orient, doing good things over there. We have young Gunter who's coming through the youth team, and obviously Alfie Whiteman alongside Fraser Forster, who probably is on his way out at the end of the season. But there's 7 goalkeepers at the club at the moment. It's a lot. And I'm just wondering, how do we kind of make sense of who's in, who's out?
I mean, if the defense is that woeful, as we discussed before, maybe you just play all 7 in goal. Absolutely. And then hope that fixes the problem.
I'm calling that for the Liverpool game. I think, Ben, just put all 7 in goal and put them all back there and see where we can get on. Just get to Anfield with all the 7 goalkeepers in there, please.
But no, Kinsky is at worst a number 2 and has really been brought in to challenge Vicario. So all the other ones you mentioned are effectively down the pecking order. Austin was excellent, arguably the man of the match against Newcastle, but he was very much forced into that spotlight. And what you will probably find once he settles is that with Vicario out, Kinsky gets some relatively imminent Premier League game time. So I expect him to be thrown straight into the deep end. And to your point about his mentality, the feeling from Tottenham is he's very strong-willed, he's very vocal, he's a good leader, he'll fit in well in the dressing room. So there's a lot of ticks for the off-field qualities. And I think part of his upbringing is down to his dad, who was also a goalkeeper and looks after him. And he basically said, from what I'm told anyway, that the dad would meet Levy, and if the dad was sold, he was sold. So his dad was intermediary, agent, father, all in one. And as you would expect, he's being compared in style to Petr Cech. But there are a couple of key differences here stylistically. So the thing with Petr Cech is, if you look at how he positioned himself on the line, Cech would invite you where to shoot. He'd leave a bigger gap at his near post. He'd come a couple of steps off his line and he'd say, you put it there if you think you could beat me. And he'd leave you a gap on one side at the near post, and that would allow him to obviously take the extra step across to his far post if he needed to dive across, make an interception or a save. So he'd bait you a little bit, very subtly, but very obviously. Whereas what you find with Kinsky is two slightly different extremes. So when he's on his line, he's on his line, and he backs his instinct and his reaction to elevate himself athletically, whether up in the air, down on the ground, out into the 6-yard area. He backs himself to either accelerate or get up and down the goal, depending on if he's going to a top or a bottom corner quickly. So he doesn't need to take that extra step like Cech did. And it might mean in a weird way that when you look at him, you don't think he's as commanding in his goal. But what he's doing is intelligently holding a position and making it harder for people that are going to take shots or are going to rush around him in the box to know what direction he's going to go in, whether he's going to come off his line, whether he's going to catch the ball, whether he's going to go down too early. He makes that decision making a bit later than Petr Cech and physically a bit less obviously. So even though he still gets down as quick as any other goalkeeper, it's more deceptive. And that puts doubt in strikers' minds because they don't quite know what the goalkeeper's going to do. So if you think of it in penalty terms, how many times do we see a goalkeeper go too early and somebody can just roll it in, not finding the corner because the goalkeeper's been too over-exuberant, they've shown their hand too early. He does the opposite, even in open play. He doesn't show his hand. And that is a very underrated skill. Then if you look at sort of some of the other qualities that he has, I think he has been playing at his time at Slavia Prague very high up the pitch and is therefore heavily involved in all of the build-up. He's not afraid to come off his line. And so, like I said before, he'll appear to stay on it and you'll think, come off your line. And then you'll suddenly be like, wow, you got out quickly and you still claim the ball. So there's those two options of take that extra second so he can think, does he need to come off his line or is he going to flap at it? No, I'm going to wait. Get down and make the save. Yes, I'm going to come and I've gathered the ball. But you might, as a fan, second guess him to begin with because you'll be like, that was a bit of a slow reaction. But it's not the sluggishness. It's the mental intelligence and the backing of his own physical qualities to make the decision first and then still have the acceleration and the physicality and the intelligence to do what he has to do. So he's reliable. And I think the other thing that I really like about him is that he should just be very effective in this Tottenham system. Because if you're going to play the high line, then the fact that he can play out with his feet, the fact that his distribution is good, the fact that he is used to, under non-pressure situations when Tottenham have got the ball, being outside of his box, all of these things are very beneficial. So it should be a top signing and a steal at 12.5 million. And as I say, Tottenham's perspective is kind of, Vicario is the number one, but is he? Vicario is the number one when he's fit, but could this kid challenge? So it's not a case of 1 and 2. It's a case of, Vicario is probably the short-term number one, but Tottenham really believe that Kinsky has the long-term potential to either challenge or supplant him.
Yep. I think what's really interesting on these points, and Shawnee said as well that what's interesting is that I can guarantee him one thing. He's definitely going to be tested as a goalkeeper at Tottenham. Don't worry about the shot. So we'll very quickly get him into the routine of having a shot saved. Don't worry about it because, as I think, Ben, you said in the opening piece when we were talking about the stats underhand in December, it was in the hundreds that we were obviously having to defend shots. So look, there's a lot to discuss still. We are going to go for our next break of the show for our listeners on audio. We have got nearly over 7,000 of you that are watching the show live. As always, thank you so much for all your incredible support for Last Word on Spurs. We have officially opened our January transfer window here. I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Shawnee Butler, over at the Spurs Talk Show. And look, we're joined by, whenever he comes on here, the love for him, the adulation, the oracle, the comments go ballistic. It only means Ben Jacobs is back on the Last Word on Spurs. Broadcaster, journalist, events host. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere. Go easy on him. It's a big month install, we know, for Ben. And we've got to keep him going till the end of the month. We've got to get him back for more. So we are conscious of time. It is name time. So we're going to rattle through names. I know this is Shawnee's favourite part of the show, and names are coming in. This is when everyone gets really, really excited. The names are coming. The names are coming. Right. We're going to start on the defensive side of things, Ben, if you don't mind. And look, I think, as many know right now, that is the one area that Spurs are already suffering in terms of defence. There has been links already during this January transfer window to the likes of Khusanov. There's Thomas Christensen being linked. And there also, we understand, is rumours around Ko Itakura being linked to the club as a potentially a backup option later in the window. Defensive-wise, Ben, any of those players that I've read out, do you feel are potential targets that are on Spurs' radar during this January transfer window?
Yeah,
Ben,
I think
just before Ben, just quickly before you answer, can I just throw one more name in there that I'd love to hear if there's any possibility? Sure. David Hanko at Feyenoord. I've heard rumours that he might be in there. And he's a left back, left-sided centre back. I'd love him at Tottenham. Just wondering if you've heard anything on that radar as well with him.
Yeah, Hanko, I'm not aware that they've made any kind of approach or anything like that. You'd be surprised how many make the shortlist. It's at least 7 or 8.
We have to try.
And I know that Forest like that player as well, but I'm not aware, unfortunately, from your point of view anyway, of any kind of meaningful approach there. I think that Khusanov is the one that a lot of clubs highly rate, including Tottenham. And we know that Manchester City are expected to be in the mix there. I think we also should keep an eye on Ko Itakura, where there is substance to the Tottenham links. And it's fair to say that Napoli are firmly in the conversation there as well. I'm hearing a little bit less at the moment about Thomas Christensen. That's not one that Tottenham sources are particularly standing up at this stage. And a lot of people, by the way, asked me about Mark Gay as well, because the feeling is that he might be available on the market. It appears that Chelsea are going to try and re-sign the player, and that's not a name at the moment that Tottenham are considering. And when you think about the price over the summer, 70 million plus for Newcastle United, you can understand why. But interestingly, he's only got 18 months left on his contract. So it'll be intriguing to see whether or not the price drops to such a point that other clubs, including Chelsea, see it as a bargain, but nothing really to add as far as Tottenham and Gay are concerned at the moment. And then there's still Milan Skriniar, which probably is not going to be a popular name as far as Tottenham are concerned because of his age. And we know that a few summers ago, they tried for him and he ended up going to PSG and it hasn't really worked there. And now Galatasaray at the club really speaking to Skriniar and trying to get that over the line, but it's not done yet. And he's the type of older stopgap name that will be available on a bargain. PSG are very willing to do a deal, negotiate his exit. They want to get his wage off the books. So this is where we have to split the defensive targets between who do Tottenham want long run, and a player like Khusanov falls into that category, or who might they get in January being a bit more short-termist just to get through this season, even if they're not as exciting, even if they're a little bit older, even if there's a few doubts about the player. And Skriniar may fall into that category. At the moment, it's Galatasaray negotiating, but Tottenham are certainly alert to that potential opportunity. And the players always wanted to play in the Premier League as well. There's just nothing that's moved at this point, but it's a long window ahead. And the same can be said for Bastoni, obviously, who Tottenham would have taken in a heartbeat if they could have possibly got him. Player reminds me a bit of Martin Zubimendi. He's just through and through. He bleeds blue and black. And as a consequence, the opportunity's never been there. Now, if that changes, I don't think January is a possibility. But if it ever comes to the point where the player thinks, you know what, it might be time to move on, then Tottenham, and that's the Paratici influence, will be back in the mix for that. But you don't waste your time, particularly in the January window. It's a seller's market. If you feel there is a player that just isn't going to leave or a club that isn't going to sell, then as much as fans may make the link and want the player, you don't have time to be chasing after lost causes. And unfortunately, Bastoni is currently a lost cause. But let's keep an eye on that one in the next sort of 3 to 5 windows, because there may come a point where the player finally says, actually, I am prepared to leave Inter.
Ben, switching out of the centre-back space, but staying on the sort of left side of defence there, we've got a big name, a young guy who ticks the boxes, I guess, this season at least, with regard to his versatility in Patrick Dorgu of Lecce. Look, for me, an amazing talent, very, very attacking. Although this season he spent most of his time, as far as I'm aware, playing as almost like a right-wing forward, being able to invert onto his left foot. Lots of links with him to Tottenham. Rumours are, though, that maybe his form and the interest that's not just coming from our direction has possibly put his valuation beyond the £30 million mark. First of all, are the links real? And second of all, at that kind of elevated price from what I think was a lot lower not that long ago, do you think that maybe has priced us out of the market? Are Tottenham still interested at that £30 million mark? And if so,
yeah, the links are real.
They are they? Just out of curiosity, because I think of the 15 games he's played this season, 10 of them I think have been playing as a right wing forward, although he has had moments all over the park on the left and the right. Where would Tottenham see him? Is it more of a left back or as a right wing forward to compete with Brennan Johnson?
Yeah, it's like I said before, the value is in the versatility. So in the same way that you have the Archie Gray signing where he was right back for Leeds, but he's also been used in central midfield and the player wants to develop there. Dorgu kind of falls into that category as well. So you're absolutely right in what you say, that he has played as effectively a more advanced right winger, and that's been his predominant position this season. But if you go back a bit further, left back or left midfield, and I think Tottenham are looking at that left side, but knowing that he can switch sides or play in a more advanced role. And that's the kind of thing, again, that Postecoglou loves, a player that can cover more than one position. But it is the left-sided fullback, I'm told, that Tottenham are predominantly looking at. But I don't think they're ruling out either side. So maybe we can be a bit more broad and just say fullback. And there's relatively good news. It might be the first time tonight that I've brought good news. My info is not that this price tag for Dorgu is £30 million. My information is that he will be available on the market for 25 to 30 million euros. So around about 10 million cheaper, perhaps, depending on the structure of the deal, than some have reported. And a bargain, you could argue, compared to Milos Kirkos, 40 million plus, another left fullback that Tottenham have looked at, and Nuno Mendes, who is not in the conversation for Tottenham, but Manchester United are believed to be looking at. And they will be pricier compared to Dorgu. So don't presume, if Tottenham want to move, that price will be the prohibitive point. When Tottenham first inquired about the player over the summer and even into October of last year with a view to this year, it was true that the rough estimation was 40 million euros, which is 30 million pounds. But clubs outside of windows tend to do this. They put the highest possible valuation on it. You see in the market that there's several suitors. A bidding war before the window even opens is created. And often it can be quite fictional as a tactic to try and get the highest possible price. But my understanding is 25 to 30 million euros is the kind of price that Dorgu might be available for. And January is not impossible. If Tottenham wait, then I think Milos Kirkos is a name along with Manchester United. If they don't buy a left wing back before then, that Tottenham will be in the conversation for, to the tune of 40 odd million if Bournemouth get their way. And then there's a little bit of substance to the interest in Tyreek Mitchell as well, but only really at this stage in the sense there's been an internal discussion. I'm not aware of any kind of meaningful bid at this stage, but it's obvious, as I said right at the beginning of the show, that the left back or the left wing back or the versatile left-sided player is high on the list of priorities, either for January or summer 2025.
Ben, thank you so much. I want to take us a bit further up the pitch, and for our watching audience, we are conscious of time, strike it off those bingo cards. Well, like I say, we are trying to elevate and quicken up the pace of the show, so we might start combining as we go here certain players, certain links. There's been some news, Ben, and like I say, I mean, in terms of sources wise, it'll be intriguing to get your thoughts on this. This has come probably, I'd say, late on the Monday evening, rumours circulating that Tottenham have had a bid rejected for the Colombian midfielder Richard Rio. Now, it's understood that the club are not looking to sell the player until at least after the 2025 FIFA Club World Cup. I'm going to be honest about it. I don't know a huge degree about the player. I think there's been previously reported interest from Manchester United in this individual. Ben, from what you understand, have you heard anything remotely with regards to this player being linked to Tottenham?
Yeah, as you say, this is a story that broke this evening, so not too many calls have been made at my end. I respect others reporting, but I certainly can't confirm firsthand whilst we're live the rejected bid. But what I am told is that there's a couple of Premier League clubs that have looked at the player, and I think the most active of them is Wolves, rather than necessarily Tottenham or Manchester United or some of the other clubs that we've mentioned or have been linked. He's a central midfielder with a lot of height on him. He came through the Flamingo youth team. He's now at Palmeiras. And as you rightly say, the same, by the way, with Esteval Willian, they want to keep their squad together for the Club World Cup. So this is not likely to be the kind of deal that's going to take place in January. He is very old school in his qualities, tenacious, box to box, can play in a metronome role, but can also burst forwards into the sort of 8 role or advanced 8 and get goals and assists, and can even get out wide as well. So that's the sort of versatility there. And for someone that really predominantly at Palmeiras does play quite deep, like right in that old school arc of central midfield, or right midfield is another position that he can play. So for a box-to-box central midfielder, a DM or a right midfielder from pretty deep areas, I wouldn't even call him a right winger. I'd call him an old school right midfielder in those sort of 80s 4-4-2s where they don't quite get wide enough or further enough forwards to be classified as what we would call a modern winger or fullback. So you wouldn't expect that much output from him. And yet he's had a real breakthrough season in the Brazilian Serie A and started adding goals to his game. And most of those goals and assists have come in the last season. So if you look historically at what he's done, it can only be a handful of goals throughout his career and a handful of assists. And yet 3 of those goals, and I think 4 assists perhaps, came in 24 league games. Whereas a bit like Declan Rice when he was defensive minded at West Ham, and then suddenly out of nowhere, something clicked and he started adding attacking output in his final season at West Ham into his first season at Arsenal. It feels like Rios is kind of going through that progression as well. So at this stage, I can't confirm a Spurs bid or any kind of rejection, but naturally making calls on it. But the last I heard, the Premier League club most interested were Wolves.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Ben, who can I just say, hand back to Ben. I'm going to hand back to Shawnee, who is going to ask you, I think, about the player that everybody has been waiting really with bated breath as to, Ben, where we are in the pursuit of a certain forward. I'll hand to Shawnee to take the stage.
Well, the name is, of course, Randal Kolo Muani. When the news broke, I was a very happy boy. I'm a big fan of this player. Hasn't really worked out at PSG. £75 million move from Frankfurt in 2023. That the guy back in his Frankfurt days was an absolute. He changed the game. He was a brilliant World Cup performer, and for whatever reason, it hasn't worked out at PSG. But from what I've heard, and from, I guess from what we're going to lead you to give us some clarification on here is, are the rumors true? I was hearing rumors that maybe that the agents or the representatives were in Tottenham a couple of days ago, and there might have been even some rumors that Langer and Daniel Levy got back on a plane to France later on that day. I don't know if that's true, Ben, but first of all, if it's true, how would the structure of the deal be? Would it be a loan with an obligation or an option, or would it be a straight purchase? And would that be a demonstration of Tottenham's willingness to sort of push the boat out a little bit with regards to the wage structure to try to catch up with some of the teams above us?
Yeah, we've seen fresh reports, obviously, this evening from the excellent David Ornstein. A couple of days ago, I mentioned Tottenham and how they had initiated contacts over Randal Kolo Muani. So there is substance to this one. And Tottenham are very intent about trying to get this one over the line. And of course, we've seen several clubs linked with Kolo Muani. But the good news from the Premier League ones that I can bring you this evening is that Manchester United are downplaying their chances of success with Kolo Muani. And even though we saw reports, and again, I, of course, respect others, so I'm not here to shout down intentionally anybody else's reporting, but even though we saw some links out of France about Chelsea, I'm again told that they are not in the race for Kolo Muani. So from the Premier League clubs, I think it's fair to say that Tottenham are the front runners and Aston Villa are the other club that have looked and may have a bit of leverage because PSG have an element of interest in John Duran. But I think the Muani deal and the reason why Manchester United are quite pessimistic about it is going to be one, singular, not a swap deal, and two, is likely to come with an element of permanence, which is why I think Manchester United feel less inclined to go for it on the kind of terms that PSG are looking for. So the key thing in a window like this is if there's lots of interest in the early stage, the buyer holds all the cards, and then we wait and see whether or not the ability for that buyer to put pressure on a deal now gets the terms that they want, or whether PSG let it sweat out a bit in the hope that people change and up the offers and so on. But it's very rare to have a bidding war this early in a window. And that definitely does give the buyers collectively some kind of advantage because most of them are looking for the same thing, a loan plus something. And that's likely to mean that PSG cede in terms of structure to a loan over a permanent sale. So we've heard some reports that 50, 60 million is going to be the price and that maybe PSG are going to be demanding that with a permanent exit. That's not my understanding. I think at this stage it will be a loan. And then the key question, depending on who stays in the race and who has the ascendancy in terms of the game in a very fast window, is are PSG going to eventually say it's loan with option, in which case Manchester United very firmly re-enter that race, or will it be, as I understand it as of now, a loan with an obligation? And if it is a loan with an obligation, I don't think that Manchester United go down that route. So then you're left with Spurs, you're left with Juventus, possibly in a kind of head-to-head. And then let's see if that's a knock-on effect and Dusan Vlahovic ends up going anywhere. Other clubs that we should mention, although differing degrees of either interest or advancement, Leipzig, who appear out of the race at the moment, but had made an inquiry. Bayern could still potentially be one to watch as well. And there's a little bit of interest out of Italy as well. But I think that David was relatively accurate when he said that Tottenham, possibly Manchester United, although I've had that downplayed a little bit, and Juventus are the three that are the most advanced at this stage. And once again, loan with, if it's PSG's way, obligation. And the last point is that if this gets done, it will not be done through Lang and Campos. It will be done through Khalifi and Daniel Levy, and they have the relationship. And if there's any business to be done, this will be a Daniel Levy deal direct with the PSG president, and that relationship between them, they're on very favorable terms. They work together at the ECA. They've known each other for many years. They held the investment talks that we discussed in January 2023. They have a strong personal and professional relationship. So sometimes, of course, fans will criticize Levy and his involvement in transfers. But what I would say is if there was one club outside of the Premier League where you would want Daniel Levy fighting in your corner, it would be PSG negotiations, because he probably is capable of getting the kind of deal that Spurs would be looking for here to pull it off. So I do think that Tottenham are going to very strongly push to try and get Muani out of the line, over the line. And if it doesn't come off, I don't think it will be, even though you get a bit of a rewriting in history, I don't think it will be because of Tottenham going off the boil, of Tottenham finding another target. I think it will be because Tottenham just got outdone by another suitor. And then naturally, you're never going to say we failed for our top target. But I don't think it's too strong at this stage to say that right now, Muani is top of Tottenham's attack-minded list. They have also discussed, along with Manchester City, Omar Marmoush, who's had a phenomenal season at Frankfurt. The challenge there is there's no release clause. And as Man City are finding as well, the feeling is that Frankfurt are not going to sell mid-season. They're pushing for Champions League. So Marmoush is probably going to be quite a big story in the summer, but I don't think he's possible in January, whereas PSG want Muani out the door.
Do you know what, Ben? That's music to my ears. I had the audacity to put out a shameless link to Marmoush this morning, and I'm so glad that you validated it. I feel less of a fraud with my content. That's super. Thank you so much. Listen, just quickly, in the interest of time, a few more names in the striker role that have been linked with Tottenham that I'd love to get your take on, if possible, mate. Evan Ferguson from Brighton. Vitor Roque of Barcelona, I think it is at the moment, and currently, although I think he's currently at Betis, isn't he? And also Jonathan David of Lille fame. Three names that keep kind of getting up in the zeitgeist. Just wondering, what's the strength with any of those three, if any, and any prices, any kind of sort of substance. Should we get excited about any of those three?
Jonathan David was in the mix for Tottenham. They asked for the terms of the deal last summer, available on a free, and who knows? Tottenham might buy two. They may add a Muani +1. And if they spend big money on Muani on a loan with obligation, it would be normal to look for something more economical. So David's a bit of a free hit. Might not be the most popular with every fan base within the sort of big six clubs that have been linked, but you don't lose anything by adding David plus maybe another name. And that might come into Tottenham's thinking come the summer, not David instead of, but David in addition to. So I have to wait and see, but I'm not aware they've made a more concrete move since inquiring last summer. I think West Ham and Newcastle and even potentially Milan could all be clubs to watch. It'd be interesting to see, by the way, if Milan advance their interest in Marcus Rashford, but I still think they want a more traditional striker. So let's wait and see with Jonathan David, but nothing really to add or get excited about from Tottenham's point of view, other than it's a bargain deal. It's a very Daniel Levy deal, I suppose we could say. Vitor Roque's going to be very difficult because he's pretty settled at the moment playing for Betis in Seville. And the only thing that may change that, because Betis will look to add permanence to that deal. And I think they've got matching rights baked into the current loan that he's on, which means that an exit from Barcelona is likely. And then we have to wait and see whether Manuel Pellegrini leaves. And if the manager goes, will that influence the situation? But right now, I don't think Vitor Roque is looking at anything other than staying at Betis for now, where he's happy. He struggled to acclimatise at Barcelona and he's relatively content where he is. So I'm not sure that we're going to see too much movement there. And sorry, who was the third name that you wanted to know about?
Evan Ferguson.
Yeah, Evan Ferguson. I'm not hearing that much with Spurs, as I've reported before. West Ham, Fulham, Arsenal are the three clubs there. Arsenal are in a bit of trouble because maybe I should just stop there. Arsenal are in a bit of trouble and everyone will be happy on the chat.
That's perfect, Ben. I think we can close the show.
Thanks very much.
That's all we've got time for.
To finish the sentence, even though you can edit it, that just says Ben Jacobs says Arsenal in a bit of trouble. End of. Good night. Best answer I've ever given on the last word on Spurs.
That's the best.
But no, Arsenal are in a little bit of trouble because ... they filled their loan spot. So unless they send Sterling somehow back to Chelsea, they can't loan Evan Ferguson, and therefore they'd have to buy him permanently. And, we're not talking about £100 million player, but we're certainly talking about 40, 50 million in a permanent sale. And that's a bit of a risk because he's out of form. And at the moment, he's not even fit. So Brighton are still deciding if they are going to let Ferguson go and what that will look like. And if they do let him go, it may not even be a loan, even though that's what suitors like West Ham or Fulham would like. It could be a loan with an obligation or a permanent sale. There might not be any semi-permanence to an exit. So all that's still being decided. I know it sounds strange because such a quick window, but it's too early to tell with Evan Ferguson because Brighton want to get him fit first and then work out whether it's better to keep him for the depth that he offers or send him out on the market. But I'm not actually that aware of Tottenham links at this stage. I'm hearing West Ham made a concrete inquiry only a few days ago. Fulham are very alert to the opportunity, but would only take it on a loan with an option. And Arsenal like the player, but the stars may not align for them because they simply can't loan unless, as I say, they get rid of one of their two Premier League loans. And the last name that I would chuck in there, but summer, not now, is Liam Delap. And I think my sources say pretty firmly at this stage that Chelsea are going to be there pushing very hard. And because of their ex-City connections and people like Maresca that know him and London and wage and where the club is, likely with some kind of European football, Chelsea are quite confident that if they choose Delap out of probably 3 to 5 options at the moment for forwards, he would be sold on that move as well. But don't discount Tottenham. They've been very impressed with Delap, as everybody has been this season. I think it's 8 Premier League goals. And you don't just look at his goals, but you look at the hold-up play, the physicality, the hard work he does for his team off the ball, the intelligence, the monster mentality that we know that Ange Postecoglou likes. So keep an eye on Delap. There'll be several Premier League and European clubs in the mix. Chelsea are the early front runners, but Tottenham are not to be discounted.
Ben, thank you so much. As typical, we are always with you. we're always running over time, so I need to fasten things up here. We need to come to a conclusion here. I know many would love this to go for hours and hours and hours, but Spurs are not the only club Ben can cover during the transfer window. I know we'd all want him to, we'd all love him to, but unfortunately you can't just cover Tottenham. Right. Ben, I need to ask you about potential exits in terms of maybe the January window, maybe the summer, as to where we are. You touched upon Heung-min Son earlier. We're in a situation where Heung-min Son, Sergio Reguilon, and Ben Davies have now entered the final 6 months of their contract. That means any foreign clubs, from my understanding, are now allowed to speak to these players and agree a pre-arrangement ahead of a potential summer transfer. What are your thoughts on those 3 players, and where do you see those futures? Maybe not just this window, but beyond that, if this window isn't the right window for them to move on.
Reguilon, I would have said, was a goner at the beginning of the season, but obviously the doggy injury means he's suddenly come back into the fold. But I still think he'll go. Maybe a logic not in January, though, and then Tottenham just resign themselves to losing him on a free transfer in the summer. The Sevilla interest has kind of gone a little bit cold, and whether or not that changes now, he can pre-agree a contract with somebody, but I'm not aware that they've come back in for him with a view to getting him on a free transfer yet anyway. Braga is another one to watch. At the moment, they've got Adrian Marin, Yuri Ribeiro, and a youngster called Chizumbra, who has a big future ahead of him. I think he's only 19 off the top of my head, but they would like a more experienced left-sided player, and Reguilon could be the answer for them. So let's sort of see if he gets a European option as opposed to your MLSs and your Saudis, where I'm told at the moment the player's not really thinking too much about that type of move. With Ben Davies, I think that he will also be gone. And the same for Fraser Foster as well. With Davies, the natural thing is to run down the contract. Leeds United remain interested. So that could be one to watch in the coming weeks. But I think that with Kinsky arriving, Foster falls down the pecking order, and Austin has proven that he can be part of the squad as well, and is so used to waiting for opportunities that he might be more inclined to wait and hope that the cameo that he made leads to a few more, whereas Foster was playing more consistently and I think will immediately be behind Kinsky in the pecking order, and that likely means that Foster and his Spurs tenure is over, or as good as over. But again, you know, you keep them because they're good professionals, they're liked in the dressing room. The same for Ben Davies, and then they depart instead in the summer. And I think that unless somebody comes in with a healthy January offer and Tottenham can make an argument that they can live without that depth, then it's much more likely that they just resign themselves to losing them on a free transfer as far as Ben Davies is concerned, and Foster exits in the summer, just in case, even though I promised I wouldn't, I've broken Kinsky somehow, then you'd still want Foster there.
Well, I mean, that's a point there. Very quickly, just I have to ask you to follow up there, just on Heung-min Son. A lot of speculation, Ben, with regards to where we are with Sonny. You know, I think there's no getting away from it. Sonny hasn't hit the heights of last season, although, look, he's very much adored in the Spurs fan base. There's some Spurs fans here that will allow him to see out his contract and would offer him another one, you know, on top of that. But there is a feeling that this kind of, I'm not sure in the last kind of month or two that there was like a contract on the table for Son. There's certain reports that contract is now no longer there. There's been reports of there being a trigger option for a further 12 months. What do you understand to be the situation, very quickly, Ben, with Heung-min Son's future at Tottenham?
So I'm not aware of any new contract discussion with Son. It was always, and has been since pretty much last summer, the willingness at that point to trigger the 1 year and tie him down until 2026. And it's a surprise in some ways that hasn't just been done, regardless of whether he stays or goes. But the hesitation behind triggering that extra year now presents an opportunity for potential suitors that they might not have thought would have existed come last summer. So Son hasn't matched the same heights, but as I'm sure Tottenham fans realise, he's a fantastic ambassador for the club. He still offers something different, and the off-field influence is there as well. But we have to say that if the January window shuts and that year is still not triggered, then there is a situation naturally where this could be Son's last season at Tottenham. And I think it unlikely at this stage that a new contract or a long-term contract is probably the more accurate way of putting it, is going to be offered to Son. So we're left with two options, I'm told, at the moment. One is the original expectation that they just trigger the 1-year extension, and that's still there. It's not expired or anything like that. And two is that for whatever reason, likely down to terms and maybe some kind of wage reduction, Son agrees to stay on under different terms to now, but still a 1-year extension. But I'm not told that Spurs are thinking about anything other than a 1-year extension, whether triggered or whether new. Maybe there's a logic they sit down and say 1+1, or maybe there's a logic that they finally just do trigger it. But nobody that I've spoken to has really given a clear explanation as to why they've delayed triggering it. And I say delayed triggering it because I was told by several sources within Tottenham, not that they might trigger it, not that they could trigger it, but that it was a default that they would trigger it. Right. And that was July, August, September, October. And then suddenly we get to November, December, January, and it still hasn't been triggered. And to be honest with you, I still don't have the answer for that. Tottenham, fair play to them, are good at keeping some secrets. And I can't give you an explanation as to why a near guarantee it would be triggered has now gone to effectively limbo. Where he might go, a couple of interesting links. One, which is a new one that I can give you here on Last Word on Spurs, is Frankfurt. So that would be a return to Germany. They're interested in the situation, and we wait and see whether they advance it in any way. They've not had any direct contact with Son yet, but that could be one to watch. And then Saudi is the other one where Son has said publicly he doesn't want to go to Saudi, but if he's in a position where he feels his Spurs tenure is ending, does he change his mind? And I can guarantee you that if there is even a 1% opportunity for Saudi to pitch to Son to change his mind, they will move aggressively. And Al Ahly are the club for Son to watch at the moment. And Son has been on the original list of targets for Saudi Arabia for the last 2 years, but they've never wasted their time advancing anything because they realized the contractual situation didn't open a window of possibility. And Son had said that Saudi wasn't for him. But of course, when he said that, it was like Ronaldo had joined and a few others had joined and nobody knew how the project was going to go. Whereas let's say he was open to Saudi this summer, or if it's extended till 2026, the summer after, then you're looking at a year or 2 more years, the Saudi Pro League, where who knows how many top players may be there. And I think a number of players have changed their mind. Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang is one example. So Al Ahly wanted Rashford, but Rashford doesn't want to go to Saudi. Al Ahly want Ademola Lookman also on the left side. It's a crazy ambitious move, and there's almost no chance that that's going to come off. Atlanta are top of Serie A. He's not going to go mid-season or probably in the summer either. So now they're drawing up a list of other wide attackers, versatile attackers, players that can float left or central. And there's a possibility that Son is going to come onto their shortlist if he opens the door to Saudi Arabia. Right now, I'd say it's 99.9% shut by Son to Saudi Arabia. But just to add a little bit of context as well, the reason why they want Son and want Casemiro and in the long run want Bruno Fernandes and others is because this summer, the television rights cycle renews. And it's the first real cycle because the first one was done in-house. It was given to Saudi Sports Company. It's the first cycle where the Middle East and North Africa and the international markets will all be split. And because of your Ronaldo in Portugal, or maybe if he was to join your Mo Salah in Egypt, there's a chance for them for the first time to sell internationally to certain individual territories and get a return on investment. And as a consequence, the idea of Son, South Korea, Salah, Egypt, Bruno Fernandes, Portugal, because Ronaldo won't be there forever, because the TV cycles are 5 years, the feeling is that these are the names that might be the difference between getting a big return on investment in television revenue and audience, or the league tapering off in the coming years. So this is why I think that Saudi have never gone away from Son. Son's just gone away from Saudi. And let's see if he doesn't stay at Spurs, whether his perspective changes.
Ben, we can't thank you enough. We've got to look for a close on this show. We've got 2 final questions to ask you before Shuddy comes in there. Just need to ask you about three final names, if you don't mind. Brian Hill reports that Girona are reportedly seriously considering activating that, I'm led to believe, 15 million purchase clause in their loan agreement for the winger. We've also got the situation around another winger. You've also brought him up, Timo Werner. I want to ask if there's any possibility that he actually leaves the club sooner rather than later, maybe being January, in terms of maybe a potential route back to Leipzig if it is not to be the summer. And finally, Richarlison. Maybe, again, these names are more summer than now. Those three final names before we look to close, Ben. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think with the Gill situation, I'm not so sure that they're thinking about activating the 15 million, but they want to sign the player permanently. It's more of a Jed Spence Genoa type situation where they actually think that the buy clause at 15 million euros is a little bit too expensive, and they're looking to go to Tottenham and try and renegotiate that a little bit, ultimately get it down. Tottenham didn't budge on Jed Spence, and he ended up fighting his way back into the squad. So let's see how that pans out. But it is true that Girona would like to try and sign him if possible, just not necessarily at the 15 million that you mention. So that's the sort of first name. Timo Werner was the second name, right?
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
So Werner, I don't think, will stay at Spurs. All accounts at the moment are that they're not going to take the option to buy, and that will inform their markets and who positional wise they look to replace Werner. And if you lose Werner and potentially Son, or you think he's going to have a diminished role, then it becomes even more important to find a wide goal scoring player. And Postecoglou has a sort of strange approach to this because he does like his wingers to be quite old school, wide, touchline hugging, but they have to have offensive output. And Werner simply doesn't, whereas Son throughout his career has done, albeit playing in a slightly different profile and a number of different roles. But I think the other thing with Werner, as much as they like the mentality and the personality off the field, they feel like, as Postecoglou said, that this season he's not had that physical and emotional intensity in games. So then when you add the lack of goals as well, it's just not a fit anymore. And it's strange because when he first arrived, he couldn't have been more of a Ange Postecoglou type signing. He had everything on paper, even though we know historically throughout his career, he's never been that prolific. And yet he's got worse in some ways at Tottenham. And that's not a good sign. And therefore, having renewed it once to keep him at the club longer, I think they've seen enough of him now to know that they need to replace him in the long run. So I'm not expecting that option to be taken. And maybe it's just because we're nearly at midnight, but who's the third name? I'm forgetting all the questions now.
Richarlison.
I know I'm rambling on.
My fault, Ben. We're throwing too many at you. Richarlison, very quickly, Richarlison. I know this window probably very unlikely, but summer transfer window, he shut down the Saudi links, as you remember, last summer. Do you think this summer that may be reopened, given the fact of Richarlison and what might come with him? What do you think with Richarlison, very quickly?
I don't know if he's changed his mind about Saudi. I think the door's still shut there. It was Al Ali that tried, and they went on to sign Ivan Toney. But what I do think is that he's changed his mind about leaving Spurs. And there was a point, of course, where he was sorting out his mental health, and it was great to see him happy and healthy off the field. And the feeling was that that would translate well on the field as well. And at that point, he wanted stability and to stay at Spurs, and was very appreciative of all the Spurs family that had rallied around him. Now I think he's looking to the 2026 World Cup and saying, if I stay at Spurs, is this my best chance of getting selection for the Brazilian national team? And at the moment, it's a pretty emphatic no. So I'm told the player's changed his mind about potentially leaving Spurs, but not necessarily straight to Saudi Arabia, which could be damaging for his World Cup chances. And Al Ali that tried to sign him obviously have bought Toney now, so they're not going to go for him. And a lot of these Saudi sides that you hear quite glibly linked, their foreign quota, which is only 8, is full. So there's also not that many Saudi sides that in this window or this calendar year will have the squad space as far as foreigners to sign Richarlison. And then the big thing in terms of where he could go is if he stays in Europe or, for example, goes back to Brazil, how are Spurs going to get a return on investment? Because when it was Saudi that were coming calling, the number was 60 million and it was pay it or don't negotiate with us. Now that price will have dropped slightly, but Tottenham will still want to command a significant fee for Richarlison. And you have a club, for example, in the Premier League like Newcastle United, who have looked at Richarlison, but they would only do that deal if it was a loan with an obligation. The obligation would only kick in if they had Champions League or European football. And sources there say they'd be looking at 35 or 40 million, which is significantly below Spurs' valuation from last summer. So something's got to give on the Richarlison front. I think there is a very strong possibility that he leaves in the summer with the 2026 World Cup in mind. I think there's a very strong possibility that he stays in Europe, but I also think there's a very strong possibility that nothing significant will happen unless Spurs knock 10 or 15 million off their asking price.
Ben, like
happy
I said,
happy to do that. 40 million. Thank you very much. See you later, Richie.
I'm going to say, we said it's a lot of last one Spurs guests. Ben, we've got to get you out of here. We don't say you're a Spurs fan. Get yourself out of here. We're going to close. These are the final two as quick fire questions you're going to ever hear in your time on last one Spurs. Shawnee, you take the first one. I'll take the last one. Shawnee, we'll throw it over to you very quickly as we sink the close on this show. And let's get Ben out of here.
Where are we up to? Which one are we up to here?
We are looking at the fact of what we're... Actually, I'll take the first one. You can take the last one. I'll go to Ben on this question. Ben, what do you feel in your mind, quick fire, would constitute now a successful season under Ange Postecoglou, given the domestic form we find ourselves in?
Win the League Cup, beat Liverpool and Arsenal if they go through in the process. That's probably the first sign of success. Calm everybody down a little bit. Bring a trophy. Postecoglou lives up to what he promised. So that's all positive. And then I think from here, you just have to say in the league, any kind of European football, whether that's top 7 or top 8, I don't think that they're going to be in the race for top 5. But if you think about how do they get in the race for some form of European football, they need catch up, which means their form between now and the end of the season to finish, say, 7th or 8th, depending on FA Cups and what's good enough for European football, the form they would need is Champions League form. So effectively, top 4 or top 5 form, which would probably result in a 6th or 7th place finish. And if they can do that, they've got the momentum. That's a good season. Add the League Cup and everybody suddenly has a slightly different perspective because they only remember the second half of the season and the trophy. The flip side is if they finish in mid-table mediocrity or worse and get knocked out the League Cup in the semi-final, that's when you head into the summer and it's suddenly a poor season and the pressure grows on Postecoglou.
Ben, thank you so much. Shawnee's going to close it on our favourite question of the transfer window we always ask you. Shawnee, let's hand over to you to close it. Go for it, Shawnee, please.
Mate, it's always the most important question. I know it's only a few days in. How many players, what's the number? How many players can Tottenham fans hang their hat on? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or dream world more? What's going to happen? What's the number before the end of the window?
Let's finish on a positive. I'm going to be a little bit optimistic. We're not counting Kinsky, by the way. That's one already in. But new signings from now, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3.
Oh, okay. Love that. Ben, you're not a Tottenham fan. You can get yourself out of here. I want to say a massive thank you to our watching audience. Over 8,000 of you have watched this show live. I've been joined for the first time by many, hopefully to come, by the wonderful Shawnee at the Spurs Talk Show, but from the fabulous, the superb broadcaster, journalist, event host, and God, even more. You'll see him here, there, and everywhere during this transfer window. The wonderful Ben Jacobs on Last Word on Spurs. He'll be back for more towards the end of this transfer window. From us all here, please keep safe, keep well, and as always, come on, you Spurs.